Hello and welcome to our weekly Hāpara webinar series. Thank you all for tuning in and joining us. I'm really excited today to have Eugene Pinkard to talk about using school climate data to improve schools during a pandemic. I guess the webinar is what we're doing here. So Eugene, thank you so much for joining us. Eugene's from the Aspen Institute. And so tell us a little bit about your background, Eugene, and what you do.
Sure, thanks for having us, Robert. We're super excited to share this work and what we're hearing from leaders in the field. I myself am the Director of Practice and Leadership at the Aspen Education and Society program. And so our work focuses on identifying the issues that will really drive equity into our school systems, into the experiences of our students, whether it's for practitioners, system leaders, or policymakers. And we do that work by bringing together research, school leaders, district leaders in networks and in convenings where we can really take some time to step back from the work and think through these really complex problems that everybody confronts when they walk into school. My personal background is as an educator. I started as a teacher, first in a rural school in South Africa, and then came back to the DC area where I've spent my career since as a teacher, then eventually as a principal at both the high school and the elementary level, eventually moving into some district leader positions where I focused on equity, on school turnaround, and on systems development. So I'm happy to be here, and I'm happy to be in a position where I'm able to see great work around a lot of systems and as I said, share that with more and more people.
Well, we're really excited to have you. And as you and I talked briefly about before jumping on the webinar, it's you guys have been doing this work for a long time, and the research has been out there for a long time. But some of the summer of 2020, I think, has really brought a lot of this, the discussion of equity to the forefront. And so, tell us a little bit about the toolkit that you guys have put together for principals and how it can help the educators that are watching.
Sure. I'll start with the immediate context. As you and I are discussing the news that comes out almost every day around our national and international reckoning with racialized injustice, our international recognition of the importance of science and health. And I think most importantly in this context that students are not just paying attention, students are activated. Students are leading some of these conversations. And I offer that to say that when we get into something that's really technical like school climate data, it might be tempting to feel like it's not connected to these major global issues. But what we're actually asking when we're collecting school climate data are questions like, do you feel safe? Do you feel valued? Do you feel connected to this community or someone in this community? And that question on a microcosm level or a macro level is essential to students' learning. I think where I'll start to draw down from the global issues and the broader issues is the research basis that brings us here. There's a certain intuitive sense of, yeah, I guess I'd like to know if kids feel happy or if they feel comfortable at school. There's brain science behind and validated research that when students feel a sense of belonging, they are more likely to achieve. When students feel a sense of connection in a nurturing relationship in a school building, they are less likely to engage in risky behaviors. When students feel a sense of valuation or a sense of agency, they're going to be more engaged in the instructional practice. So it's the data that we collect that answer these questions that are a starting point. It's not the end of the conversation. It's a starting point for the conversation that helps students really feel excited, engaged, and a sense of ownership in their educational experience.
It's wonderful. And now you guys have taken a lot of that data and kind of instilled it down. You've got a number of great resources, which we're going to send out to all of the people watching this webinar afterwards, and we'll include on the website because you've got some phenomenal resources. You guys just recently did put out a toolkit around some of this research that you were able to do with some recommendations for principals. Can you talk to me a little bit, for those of us who haven't read the toolkit, or those watching that haven't, can you talk to me a little bit?
People haven't read it? I thought I was told everybody to.
So they didn't do their homework before they got on the webinar, but
right, or maybe they were busy like running a school in the middle of a pandemic and trying to figure out hybrid learning and synchronous and asynchronous. And so we're cognizant of that fact, and we really try to distill this down to actionable steps, particularly around the school leader. There's a strong body of research that we do want principals to pay attention to instruction, to be engaged with the community. There is also a strong body of research around a principal's potentially biggest school-based impact is their attention to the climate that they create for learning, the climate that they create for adults and for kids. And so what we've tried to do with the toolkit is pull some of that research that I described, and we actually collaborated with research-based partners like the University of Chicago Consortium on School Research, Turnaround for Children, as well as with school districts, Cleveland Metropolitan Schools, Tulsa Public Schools, and DC Public Schools brought system leaders and principals and school staff into the room together with those researchers to talk about, here's what it looks like theoretically, and here's what it looks like practically. And if we do it well, this is one of the things that you might do in your school. So for example, convening a climate council, making sure that when you're setting up your school improvement plan, that you're thinking about metrics that include school climate data as part of how you're describing and anticipating and aspiring to student achievement. When you're convening parents for parent community meetings, how do you bring this data into that conversation? And so what we've done is identified steps under a few different headings that make sense to us and made sense to school leaders about, here's how I facilitate conversations in my community. One is, what are the leadership moves that I'm going to make? And that's really thinking about the principal, him or herself, and their leadership team. Another one is, how are we going to make this a conversation about equity? And that means not just, it does mean identifying where we see gaps and disaggregating the data because some groups of students aren't having the same quality of experience as others. It also means equity in the sense of agency. How do people feel empowered to be part of forming this school community? And then lastly, we try to cut through some of the noise. There's a lot of data on school climate, some of it qualitative, some of it quantitative, and we've tried to help folks identify where those starting points are.
And that's great. And then that's one of the questions that I have, because we work with a lot of different schools out there, and there's thousands of different data points that they can use, and there never seems to be quite the perfect data point that pulls from all of the different things that students are doing or all the different resources. So for our principals out there, how do you recommend going about picking a data point?
Yeah, so there's a couple. As I mentioned, questions around safety, and that means physical and emotional safety. And when you're utilizing tools, a lot of districts have invested millions of dollars in survey instruments, and then principals get these massive data reports. The questions that are asking students: do you feel safe? Is there an adult in this building that you trust or will go to if you have a challenge? Do you feel like you belong in this community? You are valued in this community. Some of the instruments that districts have adopted ask these questions almost verbatim as I just said them. If you're a school leader in a system where perhaps you don't have a system-wide tool, there are free available tools. So Stanford University developed a tool called PERTS, and this is highlighted in the toolkit, that focuses on a few areas like teacher caring, cultural identity, and it's designed to be questions that teachers can ask in the classroom. So a school leader can invite teacher teams or invite their faculty to utilize the tool. Quick hits that you can do in your morning meeting or in your opening or closing to make sure we're checking in with students on this. And then the other thing that I would offer as a starting point is part of this conversation of a sense of belonging, a sense of safety, It's incumbent upon us to acknowledge that students live in the world that we live in and see the news that we're seeing, and are participating in some of the highly politicized conversations that we're having. If we don't acknowledge that, students will get an implicit message that this stuff that's like profoundly affecting me and has me asking so many questions about the world is apparently not relevant here in this school building. And we miss an opportunity there to fully connect with them on these questions of identity, agency, who are you going to be in this community and in this world, if we don't couple these the climate data collection with conversations about what it means in their experience.
Absolutely. We had a webinar with a teacher in Oakland last week, and she's a middle school art teacher and has used this as an opportunity to both from a, to look at different political issues, like false news around the COVID outbreak, and did an entire, unit around that, structuring it around a specific type of protest art. So it's, there's definitely opportunities for the teachers who are really engaged, who kind of want to push, who want to talk about those issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll acknowledge it. It's tricky. Like, these are difficult conversations. I think we have to be a little bit comfortable with the messiness of it right now. Because as I said, if we don't bring it up, number one, I mean, the youngest kids will certainly ask the questions. The middle schoolers will, the high schoolers will tell you, students have no cut cards, as the expression goes. They will give it to you straight, that this matters, and they're thinking about it. So it's not something to be avoided. It is something to be addressed carefully. But one of the things that we discovered, especially when visiting the schools, is that we ask these questions about climate, or check these surveys, or maybe even just looking at test scores and attendance. But really, when we're thinking about that climate data, those are just the starting points for the conversations that we actually have to have with students. Because what they also learn is whether or not their voice really matters. If you collect data from students, academic, climate, or otherwise, and as one or two students said to us, and when we did focus groups, is, yeah, I remember doing that survey, but I don't know what we did with it. Well, there's an implicit message there that, I mean, I kind of ask you what you think, but it's not really driving my practice. What we also found is that there were school leaders who had utilized that data and really changed the way that they were operating based on what they saw in the data. What we encourage leaders to do is take that next step to make that explicit and actually involve the students in that planning step. That's where the students begin to understand that, oh, not only did you ask, you actually listened. And not only did I answer, but I actually have influence and the ability to make a difference here. And that is so profound in creating a sense of belonging and a sense of identity in young people.
Have you gotten a feeling at all from the research that you've done, around, especially around the issues of like equity and race? They're difficult topics to talk about, even for adults. To sit around and for the principal and the teachers to talk about them, I think is really important. But have you found in your research, is it more teacher-led when it comes to the students? Is it more leadership-led, talking to the teachers about it to then talk to the students? Is it a combination? Like, what have you found in terms of the work that you've done?
Sure. So I've been working on this for a while, and I'm still learning. I feel like there's so much that's emerging in the field right now in terms of our understanding of what it means to lead for equity, what culturally and linguistically responsive practice and leadership look like. So there's a few things that I would share. I think from the principal perspective, and this is something that we touch on in the climate guide, in the toolkit, it's a part of the equity proposition is simply to disaggregate the data across the subgroups that we know to be communities and identities within our schools or our school system. It's simply important to know, do students have equitable access? Are they having equitable experiences? That's the first step to understand if we are actually perpetuating inequities, if we're perpetuating racialized outcomes, or if we're disrupting the trends that we see on national and international basis. There's a couple of other things that I think are important, both for leaders and for teachers. One is that we create space for adults to unpack their own bias and perception. This isn't necessarily about an explicit lesson of, let's bring African-American authors into our literature, which we should, or let's make sure that we see different faces and cultures represented, which they should be. It's also about a piece that I shared over the summer around how do we celebrate the brilliance of. The research tells us that Black students are more likely to get severe consequences in disciplinary action than white students who commit similar or the same infractions. That Black students are less likely to receive a sympathetic response even in pre-K and early grades than white students who exhibit similar behaviors. And so we have this issue where in our society, and I'm not demonizing teachers or blaming educators, in our society, our biases and presumptions are too often negative or lower for Black and brown students. And so there's a key leadership role in naming that, sharing that research, so that people understand it's not just about me pointing a finger at you or something that you did. And Robert, you and I talked about this a moment ago. It's not just about that incident. It's about the trend and the research and how now we're going to be the school, we're going to be the team that actually moves this in a different direction. And then the last thing that I would offer is that it then becomes a dialogue between the principal and the community, between the teacher and the students. This is where equity truly starts to come to life. We've done the work on unpacking our data and seeing where we have issues. We've done the work on reflecting on our practices and how we might approach them differently. And then an essential step is that we're inviting the community to the table so that we all have a role to play in creating a better space for our kids.
I think that's so important, and you know, these issues, as you and I talked about before, these issues have been around forever, and you know, it's, for some people they've really bubbled to the surface in summer of 2020. For you know, for most, you know, people out there that have been experiencing it, it's an ongoing thing. So, you know, especially for people like me who, you know, white and come from that type of background, it's so important to listen. And so, you know, what taking the data and then talking to the community, is it hosting the community, like asking parents to come in, hosting them, doing focus groups? Like, what kind of strategies are there out there for principals and teachers and other school leaders?
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing that we try to identify in the toolkit is how to infuse these conversations into routines that are fairly common in most school communities, in most leadership team routines, in observation and continuous improvement structures. So everybody's got PTA or PTO or back to school night conversations. Most schools are well versed in continuous improvement cycles or data-driven decision-making routines where they have data dashboards and they'll bring the faculty in for a PowerPoint. What we're suggesting is integrating the things that are already happening. So you probably have a continuous improvement routine. You probably have a routine of ways that you engage with parents, and you probably have some version of climate data. Those three things can exist in the same place. So if you haven't done it before, the slide that you shared with the faculty about here's what kids have said about what they really appreciate about school and where they don't feel as engaged, let's have that conversation with parents. Imagine the power of the input from parents when they say, I actually see my child reflected in that. Now, when he came home from school and he was ecstatic about Tuesday and concerned about Thursday, this actually starts to give me the language where I can help you, Mr. Principal, understand why he said what he said. One of the most profound comments that someone gave to us in developing the toolkit, two that I'll give you. One is, don't mistake data for voice. So once we've heard the numbers, we still need to have a conversation. And the second thing that we found as a really profound understanding of this is principals have the numbers, but communities have the meaning. And for us, that means, as I said at the beginning of this, collecting this data is the starting point. If you see the numbers and say kids feel great in this area, or this grade level feels excited and that one doesn't, it just means that it's now time to go to that group of students who gave those responses and ask the next question, which is, why did you say that? How did we get there? And what do you think might help you feel better about this? Or how can we replicate this good feeling in other parts of our school community?
Well, and I love that you said that the voice isn't necessarily echoed in the data, because I think that that's something that a lot of schools are struggling with right now. You know, having everybody in the classroom, I think that they struggle with it, but especially in a pandemic world where it's either, you know, partially in the classroom, hybrid learning, you know, totally at a distance, something that we haven't done before. I think that trying to get that student voice is really difficult right now, and is probably missing in a lot of school districts.
I think that's right. I think it's not been, I mean, I'm kind of old, but not super duper old, but I've been around long enough to know that our educational paradigm is really geared more towards adult expertise. And it's taking us time to understand how to create space for student voice. One of the things that we recommended is setting up a climate council. A lot of schools may have a student government, and sometimes that student government is positioned so that it is facing the other students and designed to lead the other students. There's an opportunity there to have a council where students are handpicked or cultivated or representative, where they are representing the collective student voice. It's a teachable moment where we help students understand, how do you engage the broader student body and represent their voices responsibly? What does it mean to sit at a decision-making table? I mean, these experiences are invaluable for engaging those students in a way that makes them feel, as I said earlier, powerful and impactful in the school, but also is connected to the skills that we know they'll actually need when they're going on to their post-secondary experiences. So just to get back to your initial question, it really is about creating the spaces, whether it's on a formal structure like a student government or a climate council, where there is legitimate voice and students can see the impact of their contributions. Or what we saw some principals do really well is have lunch with a different group of students every week, or maybe even every day, a small group of students, and ask them how it's going. So that you don't wind up with the quote unquote usual suspects and, you know, the valedictorian and captain and president every time. And you have kids who may feel less engaged or may have met with less success so far. Those voices are probably more informative about the things that we as adults can do better than just listening to kids who are already receiving what we're delivering.
Right. I mean, the unfortunate thing with student government sometimes is it's the kids that you already hear from all the time, you know, and it's not the ones who maybe whose voice needs to be heard probably the most out of all of them, because they're the ones who are disengaged, who are not connecting, and who aren't doing.
And that's where, again, the data can be a powerful tool, because you can't just say to a young person who is learning how to lead, who is learning how to communicate, hey, like, tell me what the other kids think. Like, the goal here is not to have a student informant. The goal here is for me to cultivate this student as a leader. Let's have this data on the table. And why don't we go ask your peers, my students, your peers, and we can go together and ask them how they perceive this data, whether they see it as valid, unpack for us a little bit where these responses came from. It teaches us all to be listeners. And as I said before, it teaches the students that we are listening to them.
And so now I'm based in Chicago, so Chicago's very diverse in terms of as a city. It's one of the most in the country. I'm curious for people who live in cities that are not that diverse. It's very apparent for some of those those students within the school that they don't want to feel singled out, or that they don't want to be how do you ask questions to identify equity issues and that sort of thing when maybe it's more of a predominantly like white school, for example, or you're in a situation like that?
Sure. So one of the things that we've seen as practices, even in federal and state policy, is that when you have a subgroup that's below a certain end size, like it's 12 kids, and so if there's a group that's feeling performing at a lower level or experiencing school at a different level, to report that out as like this subgroup is here might unfairly single out or stigmatize a small group of students, and we certainly don't want to do that. So there's some administrative discretion in how to utilize that data. I think that's then where what is really the richest piece of this, regardless of the size of that subgroup, the opportunity for teachers to have conversations and utilize some of the tools that we've identified in the toolkit, or to create some of their own, to have those follow-up conversations. So for example, setting up a routine where a teacher team is committed to weekly or every other week issuing exit slips across a grade level where we ask everybody the same question. Those could be anonymized or they could be individualized. There are opportunities for students and teachers. Teachers typically do check in with students, and often just about homework and grades and academic progress. The data that we see in the aggregated reports can inform the conversations that we have in those disaggregated and individual conversations. That creates a safer space for students to give their feedback to adults, again, knowing that I actually matter, even though I'm the only one who looks or feels like me. That matters to somebody. And it's just so essential, because we do sometimes see students slip through the cracks. And we often think of that in terms of social and wellness safety nets. But this is one of those spaces where it would be a missed opportunity if a student didn't feel the sense of safety and engagement that we hope they all do when they're with us.
And I think that that's incredibly important, and it's something that we saw. We've done a few student panels recently, and it's something that universally, in talking to the students, many of these people who are attending the webinar today, you may remember the one back in June. We talked to some students from different schools in the US and Canada and New Zealand, and universally they said that the piece that was the hardest for them during COVID when they got sent home was that they missed the one-on-one interaction with their teacher. They missed someone being there to check in to see how they were doing. And for me, that part was the heartbreaking part, because it's like, that, especially, in children who may not have, maybe in a difficult family situation or something like that, that check-in is so critical. And I think it gets lost in the shuffle sometimes with, trying to do synchronous, asynchronous, let's get the information there, let's meet the standards. Just having that conversation is so important.
Yeah, Robert, we're at a place where the world is telling us to pay attention to the research. So there's no question that the social, emotional, and academic development of students have often been divorced from one another and are actually fully integrated. And so I don't simply mean that students need to have these SEL skills and these SEL conditions in place for learning. I also mean that when students are engaging in academic rigor, that's actually a social emotional experience in and of itself. It's about resilience, it's about recognizing your assets, it's about reflection. That's what it takes to be successful academically. And in fact, if we just talk about social emotional skills without bringing in achievement and rigor and a drive towards achievement objectives, then it for students feels lacking, because our relationship here, my relationship to this school community, my relationship to this educator, is for a purpose. So social, emotional, and academic, the research tells us that the social, emotional, and academic development are deeply intertwined. And what the world is telling us right now is that if you're not checking on kids, if you're not asking people if they're okay, then they're not going to be, they are literally not going to be available for learning right now, not just because of broadband access and computers. We can send those out to folks, and many districts have. But if they don't feel connected, safe, if they don't know that somebody's just saying like, hey, are you okay? Because this is really stressful. It's going to be hard for them to access the other content that we hope to talk about.
Well, and there was a recent study that was done, which I think it astounded me. We passed it around internally, which said that about 51% of teachers considered quitting over the summer, which just, was a remarkable number. One of my colleagues, who is a longtime teacher, said, not to discount the study or anything, but did they look at previous years? Because pretty much over the summer, that's the point when, teachers evaluate their choices. And so I think it's important too, that make sure that the principals are checking in with the teachers, because, everybody needs that check-in, I think, at this point. I don't care if you're in education, or if you're doing what I do, or if you're doing what you do, like it's a difficult time, I think, for everybody. So recognizing that.
Yeah, in a different conversation, and I think it influenced the way that we think about the toolkit. I think it's there implicitly, but not as much as part of what you're talking about, the connectedness among adults. And what we've seen from research from Carrie Liana at the University of Pittsburgh talked about how social capital among adults in the building is a driver for teacher performance. And so this is why the principal's attention to climate is so important. We often have this data from and about students and think about how we're going to move that forward, but the social capital and the climate that the adults are experiencing is part of the reason that the attention of principals in this area is so impactful on school achievement. And what we all know is that it's the teacher in the classroom that's the difference maker for achievement, and it's the principal in the building that's the single biggest variable on school-to-school variance.
I want to talk to you a little bit about student agency. With Hāpara, one of the tools that we have, it monitors students' activity in Chrome. And so one of the things that we try and instill with all of the teachers who use our tool is that it's important to use it in a way that builds digital citizenship, that encourages that conversation with a student, and not in like that punitive policing type way. And so, but it's a struggle, because there's different kinds of teachers out there. There's different ways of using it. Some days you just have a bad day and it's frustrating, and you would just want to close a student's tab and tell them to get on track. But talk to me, do you have any examples about schools that are doing a really good job of building student agency and kind of what they're doing that you've seen?
Sure. A couple come to mind. We have a couple of leaders who and I think this is a variation on something I shared earlier, who are really intentional about creating space for students to step up and facilitate some of these conversations. So bringing them in either as a council or at the outset of the year, reaching out to students who have been more vocal about what's happening in the school. And what we really want to encourage folks to do is bring the climate data to the table, or if they don't have the data, create the data, so that it's not just, well, a couple of kids who are squeaky wheels or a couple of kids who happen to be in leadership positions have suggested this. It gets harder to just treat it as an isolated comment when, as adults, we have this habit around looking at aggregated data and evaluating that, either formally evaluating it or just intuitively evaluating it. So bringing that climate data into those conversations where kids are saying, okay, if this is what it looks like, then here's perhaps how we might want to move forward. One of the tools that we've suggested, and we're actually working with some of our school system partners right now to turn these into templates that folks can use, and they'll be coming out shortly. But one of the things that we want to do is set up a template where a principal or a teacher can just pick it up and facilitate the conversation about the data. And that will apply to students as well, so that they can have a sense of agency, as you said, with having the follow-up conversation, reporting back to school leaders or the leadership team about here are recommendations and directions that we think we can take to keep growing our community.
And as you said at the beginning, there's some great survey tools out there, not discounting them. There's some that are, that are more affordable. There's some that are extremely expensive. They do fantastic things. But I think that sometimes we also use that as an excuse for not doing it. And it's, I'm reminded of the fact that, 100 million students right now are using Google Classroom. We're using Google across districts. You can throw together a Google form and do a survey in like 30 seconds flat and push it out, to students to start collecting that climate data. So, are there, other than like, you talked about Stanford a little bit, any other examples of, for those schools that might not have the climate data that they want to start now, they don't want to wait, where should they, what should they be asking, where should they go?
Yeah, sure. So, we've identified we had a really powerful cadre of partners engaged in our work in creating climate. And I'm actually going to pull it up because I don't want to like rattle off names and leave somebody off by accident. We were really excited with the contributions from the 3 school districts that I mentioned. So Cleveland uses a tool called the Conditions for Learning Survey, and that's one that they've developed over years and utilized across all of their schools. Both DC Public Schools and Tulsa Public Schools work with Panorama, which is a national vendor, and they contributed to the report as well. Turnaround for Children, Education First, the University of Chicago Consortium on School Research develops a tool called 5Es that they're using in your hometown, Robert, in Chicago Public Schools. TNTP, Transforming Education, have partnered with districts and with schools about asking the right questions and better understanding what to do with the data once you have it. The National Equity Project was one of our, I think, most profound partners in helping us think about this notion of student agency and community agency, not just doing things around students and communities, but doing it with them and even following them. EduDream and of course our own team at Aspen really contributed to designing the project. But I would invite folks, I know you're going to send this out. We tried to hyperlink a ton of resources in there, not to make it into a research paper, but just to make it super easy for folks to click through, like, oh, so is that what the research says? Like, I'd love to see that so that I can kind of back up my argument when I'm explaining this to some of my colleagues, or if that's what that tool is offering to districts, let me click through to that. So we've designed the toolkit to be accessible in the actionable space, but also a really good resource where people can use it as a pass through to go deeper on any of these questions.
That's great. And then there's other tools out there too. So like, for example, one of the tools that Hāpara is working on is an analysis of the work that students are doing in say, Google Classroom or other tools to help identify those students. There was an article today that ran in the New York Times just about students not showing up and the lost students out there in the COVID distance learning world. And so I think it's really important too, especially from an equity standpoint, to start identifying some of these students who are missing. And start to identify why. And I think that's an important part of the discussion.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I just, right before this, I was on a call with district leaders from several large urban centers here, well, across the nation, actually. And what we found, the good news is that in the spring and now, we're seeing really high numbers of capture rates, so to speak. So 89, 95% of students have logged in at some point. The teachers or adults have laid eyes on them in these virtual spaces, and so they're there. That's just the first tier. Now there's triage that needs to be done for that, anywhere from 10 to 4% of students that districts have not been able to find, and that often relies on help from the social services. But there's such a range of experiences within that 90% of students that have logged in, There's the students who've only logged in briefly, there's students who are like fully and deeply engaged, and everywhere in between. And so it's these questions that will help us understand the next layer of triage, or MTSS or RTI, like whatever your intervention and service framework is. This is an important set of questions and an important part of that data picture to understand how students are experiencing school right now.
I've talked with a couple of leaders recently, and one of the things that they said that they weren't expecting, with COVID, was that there'd be students who'd be doing their homework at 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, and when they asked them why, it was because they were the eldest, they were the babysitter until all the kids went to bed and they could sit down and they could do their homework. And a lot of them said, that's not something, when they talked about whether or not they wanted to do synchronous learning from a distance and sort of thing, that's something they hadn't taken into account yet, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, I mean, we're learning so much about, as a teacher, I'm in your living room now, or I'm in your bedroom, and we have a sense of students who have space and time. We kind of knew the kids that perhaps had to be caretakers for younger siblings and would see that manifest indirectly in some spaces. We have, I think, much more qualitative observational data than we did in the past. Districts are making different decisions right now about how to handle quantitative data. Are we going to run these assessments? Some of them have said we're just going to hold off. Some of them are moving forward as usual. But what we know from the research, what we know from common sense and observation, is that you can't separate how students perform from how they feel, or how they feel connected.
I love one of the parts in the report that you talk about is how it's nice to gather feedback once or twice a year, but students, in order to really be heard, in order to be shared decision makers, it needs to be an ongoing and continuous process.
Yeah, I mean, it's a conversation more than anything. The last thing I want to suggest is that we turn this into another, data mill. I feel like we've all had the conversation, regardless of how we feel about standardized assessments, et cetera, they serve a purpose. But we've all also had the conversation about, like, how many tests can we take? How many assessments are actually going to be usable? One of the things that we really want to encourage folks to do is use the data as a starting point, not necessarily feel like you have to do interim assessments and recursive teaching on all of your climate data, but it's a starting point where you can ask the same question again in conversation individually or in classrooms. It's that dialogue where students, I think, also begin to learn the language to articulate their own experience. And again, we also have the research on what employers are looking for in prospective hires, what the skill sets are that are actually most enduring and most determinant of post-secondary perseverance and post-secondary success. And those data points are tied to students' ability to problem solve, their ability to interact in social emotional spaces, their ability to self-regulate. And so it's the conversations about climate that tell us, do we as adults create a space where students can do that? And the data also tell us, are students successfully navigating that? Do they feel the experience of growing as a whole person? And if we're not paying attention to that, it's unlikely that we're going to be as impactful as we want to be, or at least not in the way that we want to be.
Absolutely. Now, when we talk about climate data, you in the report, you talk about looking at it through an equity lens. So can you tell me a little bit more about kind of what does that lens look like? How do I do that?
Yeah. So I think there's a couple of things that I would hope that folks are doing. One is that when we disaggregate the data and we say, all right, it looks like, I mean, the national trend is that you will see Black and brown students often feel lower sense of satisfaction, lower sense of feeling challenged. And so then there's a couple of ways we can read that data. We can say, well, why do the kids feel that way, and how do we change the way that they feel? And what I would suggest is a subtle differentiation in how we articulate that question is to say, what is it that we as adults are doing that creates that experience and that feeling among students? One of the issues that we recognize as an equity lens is that as adults, we are not here to fix the children. We are here to adapt, adjust, and improve our behavior and our routines so that students meet their potential. And so that's one of the primary aspects of bringing an equity lens in this is recognizing that the students are not the problem. They are not a problem to be solved. They are not to be fixed. It is our behaviors that are really what we're trying to scrutinize. And I think we've mentioned a couple of the others. One that I just passed through quickly is it's just so important to unpack the data and see where we are replicating and sustaining racialized outcomes, perhaps gender-based outcomes and inclusion, paying attention to, lastly, where students are actually able to speak up and participate in our school communities. And if we're not sure, or we're saying, I don't know, do we do that? Then that in itself may point to an area that we can reflect and improve.
You started to talk about this a little bit, but I love that you talk about creating a shared vision of care versus fixing a child.
Yeah.
I like that a lot. Can you talk to me a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think it echoes that equity lens that we just talked about. You know, the shared vision of care means that we're bringing in the parents, the community members, the faculty, and the students themselves on this conversation of what is success going to look like and how are we going to get there. And then it's not a bunch of grown-ups talking about, I mean, we do this with good intentions, where we sit at a table and have a data meeting where we try to figure out how we can help Eugene do a little bit better. I know my teachers had more than one meeting like that about me, but I was not at the table. And I think what happens in that situation is that it does create a narrative about a student being a problem to solve. And again, with the best intentions, with aspirations for achievement, but creating a paradigm where the student is passive and the student is not able to articulate what we're doing that could be different. The student's not able to even hear those highest expectations framed in a way that's empowering and welcoming and encouraging.
I'm reminded I was the Bratty student who wanted to get A's in school, and I think I got a B on an English paper. And I was lucky enough to have some transformative teachers throughout school. And one of the best lessons I learned was I went to her and I was complaining that I got a B, and I said, well, so-and-so got an A. How could they have gotten an A and I got a B? And she said, well, your paper was a B and they needed an A. And I said, well, what's that supposed to mean? And she said, she looked at me and she said, they needed an A. Some people need to feel successful. She goes, you watch, they're going to try harder in my class moving forward. And I didn't get it at the time, but it's to this day now, it's like one of the lessons that I took away. I can't even remember what the paper was on, but just this idea that some people do, they need to feel successful and feel connected, and suddenly it sparks this whole world of thought and effort and everything in the child.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is an entree to that. You know, this is equally accessible for every student in the building. The question of how do you experience what we're doing? Every student is an expert and can answer that question for themselves better than anybody else. And so it's not predicated on your GPA. It's not predicated on the articulation meeting from last year where folks identified your strengths and weaknesses or areas for growth. It's not predicated on your racial or gender identity. Your ability to contribute to that conversation is uniquely yours and uniquely valuable. And if you say that to a student, like your voice actually matters here, and then, I mean, this is crucial, that you follow through, that your data collection, whether it's the conduction of the survey or it's the report on the data afterwards, that students know that their voice and their presence makes a difference, they show up, they step up. And it's really so often when they don't, it's probably something we as adults have done to discourage it.
Now, looking through the people who are attending, we've got a number of teachers here, which I think is fantastic. And I've got a question for you, Eugene, that doesn't really have to do with necessarily climate data, but you and I were talking before we jumped on this webinar, and the the Brianna Taylor case, which has been very much in the news here recently. Only one police officer was indicted in the end. It wasn't for murder; it was for firing a bullet into the neighboring apartment. As you've been a teacher, you've been a leader, it's an important discussion to have. Some of the students aren't going to be aware of it. Some of the students are going to be extremely hurt by it because there has been an incredible social movement, justice for Brianna Taylor. How do you have that conversation with kids? How would you have that conversation with your classroom?
Yeah, that's such a tough question. I think one of the things that I've seen some of our districts do, a couple of things. I think it's important to utilize the literature that's out there. Systems, whether it's at the system level, at the principal level, or an individual teacher in their classroom, you don't have to wing it. So there are tools from districts like Chicago, which created a curricular resource called Say Their Names, and this is dating back to incidents with Michael Brown and Freddie Gray. What DC Public Schools has done is to bring together teachers who have some experience with anti-racist literature and instruction, and ask that group of teachers to audit the curriculum and look for opportunities and also look for gaps. And then other districts have identified resources that they can use even with the youngest kids, like introducing the anti-racist baby as a reading and conversation point for students to discuss with their teachers. I think that's an entry point where you don't want to just walk in and toss the newspaper on the table and say, what do you think about it? You don't necessarily want to put yourself in a position where you're pontificating on your own political stance. It's about instructional resources that are out there. Our partners like the National Equity Project can point to some of those. And there are others where I think if folks want to do the research and take the time to do it, they can do it well.
Some great ideas and some great resources. I wasn't aware of the Chicago Public resource, but that's a really good one that I'm going to take a look at.
Yep. Another organization that we've worked with in the past is Teaching Tolerance, and they have tools as well. That's not directly connected to the climate data project that we had, but what I would suggest is that one of the things we identified is that students' comments through the data and on climate can be connected to this same conversation, where we're either distinguishing or integrating our school into the global context. Because I think one thing that we can say to students is that the world is tough. The world is tough for all of us right now. We want this to be a place where it feels a little more safe, a little more insulated, and where you can learn to have the conversations and eventually take the action that's going to help the world heal.
And I can't think of a better advocacy around student agency and that sort of thing than allowing students to start to formulate opinions and to have a perspective and learn how to share their voice, and being able to do that, I think is what will transform those kids.
I think that's right. I would go so far as to say it might be the other way around. The kids are the ones who are going to transform us and transform the world. They're making that quite clear. Absolutely.
It's time. It's time. So thank you, Eugene, so much for taking the time to get together with us. There's some takeaways here that for me, it's the importance of having the data. It's the importance of looking at it through an equity lens. It's the importance of getting hearing the student voice in a way that's not just through quantitative data, and then putting together an action plan around that. Those are my big takeaways, and I hope that they're the takeaways of people that are listening, and I'm sure there's many other ones that I didn't list, but in particular,
that's a great list.
idea. Oops, sorry.
That's a great list.
in particular, your idea of, if you're going to ask a question, be willing to do something about it, I think is the most important piece, because there's nothing worse than, I mean, even being a consumer and answering a questionnaire on a product and then it never getting any better, right. It just staying the same, and it's like, well, then why'd you ask me in the first place if you're going to keep giving me the same thing?
That's absolutely right. It doesn't work. It doesn't work in a marriage. I can tell you that. It doesn't work in a classroom. It doesn't work in marketing. People, your actions will tell people if you care how they're experiencing things.
Absolutely. Any final thoughts before we jump off?
Robert, I think you summed it up really well, and I would encourage people, if you're in a space where either the resources aren't there, to take a look at the toolkit, which will point to some free resources where you can get started. And I would also say, if you're still not feeling exactly how to prioritize this, or perhaps you even have to sell it to some folks in your community, don't be afraid to utilize the research. We've tried to distill it in a way that it's in layman's terms, but once in a while people want to fact check. It's in there, and I think it makes it all the more powerful for folks to understand this isn't just touchy-feely stuff. It is essential to student achievement.
Absolutely, and thank you for taking the time. And everyone listening, student achievement, student growth, that's why we're here. That's why we're in the industry that we're in, and it's incredibly important. So thank you, Eugene, for taking the time. It's been an absolute pleasure. I could talk to you for hours. And to the people watching, thank you for taking the time to watch this webinar, whether it's live or you're watching the version that's been sent to you. We're going to make sure to include all of those attachments and links to the different resources that Eugene talks about with the Aspen Institute, the research that they've done, some of the different action items that you can use, and resources that you can immediately use to improve and act on your school's climate data. So thanks again. Hope that everyone has a wonderful and safe week, and I look forward to talking to everyone next week. Thanks, Eugene.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye now.